Welcome to this episode of Pilot Kimberly. It's been a long time coming. That's because I've been very busy. And guess what I've been busy with? You guessed it, finally getting around to officially getting my private pilot's license. So I've been deep in the study, and those of you in Australia will recognise all these texts. And that's the reason why my house is looking a little bit messy, with all these books all over the place. So, how did we get here? I talked about this a little bit in episode 1 of Pilot Kimberly. I was just going to go over it a little bit, just for those of you joining the channel for the first time. I've also got another channel called Soaring Sisters, because I'm a very active glider pilot and particularly want to get involved in doing more competition flying. And now that I've purchased my own glider, which I did about nearly 2 years ago now. It'll be 2 years in February, actually. So, my flying history is just about as diverse as my work history. So I'll go over a little bit now, although some of you probably saw episode 1 and know a little bit about it. I started flying gliders back in the mid-80s. I took my first flight in the late 70s, but didn't really take it up until the mid-80s. And by the time I decided that I might get my private pilot's license, I had about 165 hours of gliding, and I'd actually been promoted to a level 2 instructor. And I don't know if I had the chief flying instructor position at that time, but I got it shortly afterwards. So I got into a chief flying instructor position in gliding pretty quickly in my gliding career. Anyway, at about that time, a friend of mine who was a major in the Australian Army and a helicopter pilot was on the panel that selects pilots for the Australian Defence Force, and he contacted me and said that I should apply for or try to get a position as an officer and a pilot. Now, in those days, the Australian Defence Force had a position called SSO, Specialist Service Officer, in which you could enlist in the Army as, for instance, a pilot or a dentist or a doctor or something like that. And that would be your main function and duties, and you couldn't rise above the rank of captain, if I remember correctly. Someone will tell me if I've got that right. And the Army had very recently gone through a couple of court cases regarding age discrimination and been essentially unable to demonstrate that there was any good reason why certain people up to a certain age couldn't be pilots in the Army, although the Air Force was different. The Army and the Navy, I should say. So I was at the time 40 years of age, and I decided that I would go through that process. And I didn't give it a lot of thought, because ever since I was about 13, even younger actually, I took my first GA flight when I was about 13, and I just wanted to do it forever. But I'd been told shortly afterwards that because I'd had double squint surgery, and you can look that up if you want to, I would never have good stereopsis and therefore couldn't make a pilot. Now, this was from my guidance counsellor at school, who was telling me what subjects I should take in high school, if I remember correctly. And I really got quite upset about that. In fact, it affected my schooling for the next 5 years. I just decided, well, if I couldn't be a pilot, I wasn't going to be anything. And I had really, scored high on intelligence tests and everything else, and I just did poorly at school because of that. Anyway, I digress. What I decided then was I'd go and do chemistry and so on, and I went into science and did other things. But in the back of my mind, I'd always wanted to be a pilot. Something happened when my friend said I should go for that job, where I said, do you know what? To hell with what the guidance counsellor said. Why I'd never decided that when I was 18 or something, I don't know, but I decided, you know what, they just might be wrong. Maybe I will have good stereopsis. Now, the doctor who had actually operated on my eyes had made remarks to my parents, and I can remember hearing it when I was 6 years old. They had done a fabulous job on my eyes. So anyway, I applied. I got into the recruiting process, and interestingly enough, I got really hammered about my mathematics ability because my mathematics ability was superb and my school marks were awful in mathematics, so they wanted to know how I managed to cheat. And of course I hadn't cheated, I was just good at mathematics. And anyway, I scored in the top 1% of anyone that ever tested in pilot aptitude, general aptitude and mathematical aptitude. So that meant that I would go on to the next step. And the next step was hand-eye coordination. Now my friend who was the major contacted me and said, I happen to know that when we tested this instrument that we use for this testing, that the only people your age who managed to pass were glider pilots. So I thought, great, I'll have a go. So off I went down to Brisbane. And I have to tell you, that device that they use for hand-eye coordination, actually I won't describe it because I don't know what the testing is now, but I won't give anything away in case they still use it. Anyway, it's very difficult. I passed. And I was, great, I'm in. So I actually got a letter to say, come down to Tamworth, you're in the selection course. Now, from my memory, there was about, there's a number of groups of 14. I think you're in sevens, and the sevens were in pairs, so there might have been 4 or 5 groups of that. And we'd all made it through to what they call pilot selection. Now, I can talk about this because they don't do it this way anymore. And when you go through pilot selection and other types of selection for the military, you're actually sworn to never talk about how they do it. So I know now that they do it with computers and other things, so I feel quite safe in talking about this now. So we arrived at Tamworth, and once we'd settled in, the next morning we were up early to be in a lecture theatre, essentially. And they were pretty straight with us. They said, we're going to tell you in the next 5 hours all the theory you need to know. So if you need to ask a question between now and when you start flying, you better ask it. So they gave us all the standard kind of theory, you know, that you might encounter. Mostly aerodynamic stuff, but also a little bit of procedural stuff and kind of what they were looking for. Well, as much as they would tell us about what they're looking for, put it that way. And a few rules about the fact that we didn't have to salute because we weren't enlisted and so forth. But how we were to refer to them as sir and so forth. So we did all of that, and then the following day we went into first sorties, and I don't remember, I think I had 15 sorties altogether across the 14 days. There were typically 2 a day, but there might have been one for 1 day or something. And I had been told at the end of day 1 that I would be in the advanced class, and I was a bit perplexed about that because the advanced class was for candidates who had 20 hours or more of powered time, and at that time I had about 8 hours from memory. I thought it was about 2 hours, but I looked in my logbook and I think it might have been about 8. All in various things from Cessna 152s to Skyfox Gazelles and so forth. But I'd gone through to solo in 2.5 hours, and my instructor said I'd send you solo before then, but you need a minimum of 2.5 hours, which was the regulation at the time. So I arrived at the selection process with that amount of flying plus my 165 hours gliding, and was promptly told that I would be in the advanced class. Now what that meant was that we'd do our first day or 2, I think, in CT4s, doing circuits and the like, and then we'd spend the rest of the course in a Mudri Cap 10 doing lots of aerobatics and UAs and all kinds of things. So flying a tail dragger with just 8 hours, you know, experience was for me a little bit daunting, and I suggested it to the officer that perhaps they'd got it wrong and I should be in the basic class. And he promptly told me, no, with your gliding experience, we would consider you to be in the advanced class, so you're going in the advanced class. And who's to argue, right? You're on selection. So I did that. Anyway, upshot of the whole thing is that I went through that process and I got a really high rating and I was selected. And so they said to me, congratulations, you can start your flying course basically. And what that would have been was 2 hours of training, which started off with essentially basic training in the CT4. And moved on to more strategic and tactical kind of flying, and obviously onto helicopters at that point. So I went home and talked it over with my partner, and the upshot of that discussion was that we decided, despite my wanting to do it for all of my life, that I wouldn't actually decide to enlist. And there were a few people, there was particularly one person who was on the selection panel who wasn't happy with that. By the way, my friend had to stand down while I was going through the process. He wasn't allowed because of conflict of interest to be on the panel. So I elected not to do it, and do I regret it? Yeah, I do. I'm not one for regrets typically, but you know, there are certain points in your life when you go, you know, I just should have done that, and I didn't. But what I will say about regrets is I don't let them, you know, affect my future, so to speak. So what I decided that I would do instead was to build a successful business, and I did that. And the rest of what happened to that business and what happened in my life is a new story, a completely different story, and those of you who know me will know that story. Just cut to the chase, I ended up broke and homeless after my business collapsed due to mental health issues, essentially. Recovered from that, moved to Sydney, started working in Sydney, built a new life at 50-something years of age. Started gliding again, purchased my own glider, and started getting into flying competitions. Got to the point where I said, you know what, I'm now going to go and finish what I started. So I'm hoping this particular video will be encouragement to all of you who've wanted to fly, all of you who've struggled with certain aspects of that passion for wanting to fly, and struggled with exams and all those kinds of things. As you can probably tell from this, I'm going to be very honest with you about what my experience has been. So you're going to learn what it's like to learn to fly at my age. What's been really interesting to me is up until the point that my business failed, I had not really failed at much in life. And I was watching today a story about people trying out for the SAS. Now that's something that I would fail at for sure, or would have even in my 20s. I'm not the kind of physical fitness person or the person that could have the mental strength to go through the SAS training or SAS selection. But you know, when it came to flying, I rarely failed at anything. It was my passion. I felt like that I had the aptitude for it, and so it's been really interesting how much of a struggle it's been to get through some of this this training. You know, if I had probably continued from where I left off when I went through the military selection process and gone straight back and done my private pilot's license then, I would have found it really quite easy compared to now. So I want to share all of that with you, and you'll see as we go through here, I'm being completely honest with you. And it hasn't been a cakewalk. In part, that's been because some of the confidence that came from my previous, life, if you like, carried through, and my abilities don't match my confidence, and that's always a risky thing with pilots. So, a little bit of reality had to set in there. But also in my studying, we're right now smack bang in the middle of this COVID-19 thing, and I have been out of work now for 4 months. So mentally that's been very taxing for me. And while I've been studying all my life, in fact I'm doing my 4th stint at university at the moment for a double major, I found this study very hard to do. And so any of you who are struggling with it, you know, what I will say to you is, while I found it hard to do, my passion carried me through, and I know I'm going to get there in the end. So just keep at it. There's a lot to know. I'd forgotten how much the world expects pilots to know. It's an awful lot. It's worth a PhD. Now, I had tried throughout this to get footage of every stage of my flying and my learning, but the first few hours, I think the first 3 hours of learning, I didn't capture. And that's because I tend to leave all of my camera equipment up with my sailplane for my other channel, Soaring Sisters. So when it came time to go and do filming for this private pilot's training, I didn't have any cameras. I had my phone, but I just couldn't find a way to get it mounted in the aircraft. Now, the reason for that is I'm doing my training in a tail dragger, and that's unusual as well, but I do talk about that throughout the film, so you'll learn why that's happening. Anyway, upshot is I couldn't get footage of those early flights. Hopefully, we'll continue to get footage from the later flights, and we'll just find a way to mount cameras and see what we can do. So for the next few episodes, you're going to be joining me as I take this journey into getting my private pilot's license.